good evening. Nick Smith here, speaking to you from London. Welcome to the 10th in our series of Alpine ClubCasts. Tonight we're back to the 19th century and we're looking at the achievements of three great pioneers in the mountains. I really hope you enjoy it. If you're watching live on YouTube, please add any questions to the chat there as we go along and we'll try and get those answered at the end. And as usual, anyone in Zoom, you'll be unmuted at the end and do stick around for a chat and any applause. First tonight speaking is Nanna Kaalund, who's originally from Denmark and is now a postdoc research associate at the Scott Polar Research Institute in Cambridge, where she's working on the scientific practices and the material and visual cultures of Arctic expeditions to Smith Sound during the 19th and 20th centuries. She's going to talk tonight about James D. Forbes, who was born 1809. Forbes combined a passion for mountaineering both in Scotland and the Alps with his scientific research, which helped develop important new theories on heat and the movement of glaciers. Over to you, Nanna.
Thank you, Nick. I'm very happy to be joining you all this evening. A few years back, I visited the Alpine Club's fabulous library to read the private letters of James David Forbes. As a historian of science and exploration, Forbes is interesting to me because he in many ways pioneered the persona of a mountaineering scientist in Britain. Over the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about the way Forbes combined his passion for mountains with his passion for physics, and give a few examples of his alpine travels and his relationship with the Alpine Club. After Forbes passed away, his friends wrote a biography of him called The Life and Letters of James David Forbes. They described Forbes' legacy as a mountaineer in the following way. The fact that a pass had never been crossed by man before was then a reason for avoiding it. It is now an invincible attraction towards it, and Forbes, although by no means the first of English mountaineers, contributed greatly to this change of feeling by the popularity given by his writings to those alpine regions which he was among the first to explore. Because the book was written by his friends, it was of course rather flattering, but it wasn't a complete exaggeration. Forbes was in fact part of popularizing the practice of mountaineering in Britain prior to the beginning of the so-called golden age of alpinism. Forbes was, as you may know, the first honorary member of the Alpine Club, which is also why some of his private letters are held in the Alpine Club's library. Because Forbes was part of this early group of British alpine travelers who purposefully sought out difficult passes in part to advance his scientific research and in part for sport, he had a wide-ranging influence on the later practices of alpinists and holds an important place in the history of mountaineering. Forbes was born in Edinburgh in 1809 into a prominent Scottish family. He had a very speedy career progression and was already professor in natural philosophy at the age of 24. The post was at the University of Edinburgh, where he had also received his early training, and he remained there until 1860 when he took up the post of principal at St. Andrews. Forbes wrote many papers in all areas of physics, as well as vivid travel accounts of his experience mountaineering. His travel accounts were also scientific texts. This mirrored the travel writing genre from, for example, the Arctic, where descriptions of scientific experimentation and observation was intertwined with day-to-day accounts of their exploration. Forbes argued that he could describe natural phenomena better because he had experimented in what we might consider extreme environments. Today, Forbes is primarily remembered for two main areas of his research, on heat and on glacial motion. For both those areas, Forbes combined his laboratory research with his fieldwork in the mountains, and I'll be focusing on the latter today. Living in Scotland, there was plenty of opportunities for Forbes to develop his climbing skills locally. Notably, he was the first to ascend Scuanan Cillian in 1836 together with Duncan MacIntyre. But long before that, Forbes had traveled to the Alps. At the age of 16, he traveled through Europe on a grand tour with his family. And he ascended Vesuvius during this trip. The teenage Forbes undertook research on the physical geography of the Bay of Naples, which was published in the Edinburgh Journal of Science. It was a very prestigious publication for such a young person. Forbes also had his first experience with glaciers during this trip. Together with his brother, he took a guided tour to walk onto Middelglass, which he would later return to for his research on glaciers. His proper glacial research started in the 1840s. He attended the annual meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science in 1840. It was held at Glasgow that year. At this meeting, Forbes met the Swiss biologist and geologist Louis Agassiz. Many of you probably recognize his name. Agassiz was a proponent of the Ice Age theory, and he argued that by studying glacial motion in the present, you could better understand how ice had shaped the landscape in the past. Agassiz invited Forbes to join him in making observations in the Swiss Alps during the summer of 1841, and Forbes readily agreed to go. Before meeting Agassiz at the Grimsel Hospice, Forbes first crossed the glacier pass of Col du Sailly and Col du Silla. Forbes then walked to the Grimsel Hospice, passing through the Col Ferret. This visit to the Swiss Alps was significant for many reasons. First and foremost, Forbes and Agassiz succeeded in ascending the Jungfrau during this trip. There were only 3 previous recorded ascents of the Jungfrau up until this point, and Forbes was the first British traveler to do so. It's funny that Forbes didn't make much of this achievement and barely mentioned it in his published writings, but he described it in the following words to his sister. You will probably be surprised when I tell you that I have just returned from the summit of the Jungfrau, where Mr. Agassiz and I and 2 Frenchmen with 4 guides arrived yesterday afternoon at 4 o'clock. You thought me wiser than to undertake any such expedition, and I own that but for Agassiz, who had an intense anxiety to ascend the Virgin Alp, so often assailed in vain, the idea would never have occurred to me. Since it succeeded, I am, you may believe, very glad to have made the attempt, not only for the thing itself, but because it gives me a perfect idea of what I have long wished to know, the real amount and kind of difficulty of the most formidable alpine ascents. For I suppose that there is no doubt that the ascent of Mont Blanc, though longer, is by far less formidable. It seems from this description that Forbes was a little apprehensive about the idea of climbing the Jungfrau, and that it was Agassiz who pushed for it, though it doesn't seem that Forbes had actually required that much convincing. He had, as he wrote to his sister, long wished to know what it was like climbing really difficult mountains. Certainly, even if this ascent did not receive much focus in his later writings, it was highly influential for the way Forbes thought about himself working in the Alps. Forbes spent just under a month with Agassiz, and during this period they also climbed other noticeable sites, including making the second ascent of the Ewigschneehorn, a mountain between the valley of the Unteraar and Gauli glaciers. They also worked on the Unteraar glacier. There, Forbes noticed that there was a vein structure to the glacier, and this would later become part of his theorizing of glacial motion. Following this visit to the Swiss Alps, Forbes wrote his first papers on glacial motion, most notably his book Travels Through the Alps of Savoy. In these works, Forbes proposed a new way of understanding the motion of glaciers. He based his theory on the observations he had carried out, many of them with Agassiz, and his theoretical understanding of physics. Forbes argued that glacial motion was best understood by thinking about glaciers as a viscous fluid, rather than, for example, as a solid body. Forbes' research into glaciers eventually led to a dispute over priority and credit with Agassiz, and this mirrored in many ways his later disputes with the physicist, scientific naturalist, and mountaineer John Tyndall, whom Roland will introduce in a bit. The controversy with Tyndall might seem like a minor issue. Why did the question of glacial motion matter so much? Well, Forbes had expected to receive the prestigious Royal Society Copley Medal in 1859, but this didn't happen, in part because Tyndall's friend and colleague, the biologist and scientific naturalist Thomas Henry Huxley, submitted a letter to the Society that accused Forbes of having plagiarized his viscous theory. So Tyndall and Huxley not only argued that Forbes' viscous theory was wrong, but that Forbes had falsely claimed priority to it. The priority issue was difficult to deal with for Forbes, but so was Tyndall's challenge to his analysis of the glaciers. Back in the 1840s, Forbes had carried out multiple experiments over many years on the movement of the glaciers. Now with Tyndall criticizing his observations and understandings, the natural thing for Forbes would have been to go back to the Alps. But Forbes wasn't, due to a prolonged illness that first started in 1843, able to return to the glaciers to undertake further research in support of his arguments. Tindall drew on the same rhetoric of the mountaineering scientist that Forbes has done, but now Forbes was no longer able to invoke that persona to counter Tyndall's critique of his results and understandings. And this was hugely frustrating to Forbes. Here he was, someone who once climbed mountains no other Brit had succeeded in doing before, and he was getting schooled in his own game by this young person. 1859 was a strange year for Forbes. The Copley Medal debacle was a huge disappointment, but it was also the year he was elected an honorary member of the Alpine Club. Forbes had discussed his difficulties with Tyndall and Huxley in the letters to his friend Alfred Wills. Many of you will of course know Alfred Wills as the third president to the Alpine Club. He was a judge and a well-known mountaineer. In fact, his ascent of the Wetterhorn is often described as the beginning of the so-called golden age of alpinism. Wills and Forbes became good friends. They had begun a regular correspondence in 1857, which they maintained for years. Forbes' last return to the Alps was in 1850, followed only by a journey to the Norwegian glaciers in 1851. For the remainder of his life, Forbes suffered from a failure of health, which left him unable to travel or mountaineer. This also added an additional layer to Forbes' relationship with Wills and the Alpine Club. In a letter to a friend, Forbes described Wills as an alter ego. And I want to read you this passage from a letter Forbes sent to Wills, which really sums up their relationship. He wrote, "I find in the pages of your letters, always so lively and so admirably expressed, an echo of what I have myself thought and felt. I seem to live over again years long past, and to become young and robust in the vivid participation which I have in your adventures and successes. I am almost ashamed to offer you my old hammer, for which, alas, I have no further use, as a gift, but pray do not send it back. I shall be gratified by the thought that it is in the keeping of one having kindred feeling with its old master, and many an ice step may yet cut for you." We can really get a sense in this letter of Forbes' yearning towards the Alps, and how he, through the symbolic transfer of his old hammer, saw Wills as a younger and updated version of himself, in a way carrying on his legacy. I'll end my talk today with a brief anecdote from the high Arctic, which shows the far-ranging influence of Forbes' work on glaciers. In 1853, the American surgeon-turned-explorer Elisha Kent Kane had in command of the Second Grinnell Expedition traveled to the high Arctic. Kane described looking upon the large Humboldt Glacier as follows. "Imagine this, moving onward like a great glacial river, seeking outlets at every fjord and valley, rolling icy cataracts into the Atlantic and Greenland Sea. I had recognized in my quiet library at home the beautiful analogies which Forbes and Stoddard have developed between the glacier and the river, but I could not comprehend at first this complete substitution of ice for water." This analogy between the glacier and the river, which Kane was referring to here, was of course Forbes' viscous theory. Kane had studied Forbes' research before departure, but he emphasized that it wasn't until he saw it that he really understood. This emphasis on first-hand observation, of only fully understanding the theoretical study of natural phenomena when combining it with direct observation, hints at the pervasive relationship between extreme travel and scientific research, which was so central to Forbes' life. Forbes had been one of the first to use the image of a heroic alpine traveler as a means of forming a scientific argument. He emphasized the danger involved in climbing the treacherous ice, the skills it took not only to ascend the mountain, but to also undertake scientific experiments while engaged in this dangerous and exciting sport. and this is part of Forbes' main legacy today. And with this, I would like to say thank you for your attention and turn over to Nick. Are you there, Nick?
Yes, thank you, Nanna. Really interesting stuff. So next tonight, Roland Jackson. Roland works in various guises on the history, policy and ethics of science and technology. He was brought up in the Lake District and he lives partly in Cumbria but is currently marooned in Hertfordshire. The paperback edition of his biography, The Ascent of John Tyndall, is published next month. John Tindall, born in about 1820, is a name which for me has popped up continually in the mountains, from the Peak Tyndall on the Matterhorn Traverse to the Tyndall Glacier on Mount Kenya. And I remember too being greeted by his bearded face on the door of the Weisshorn hut after a near 20-hour traverse to the Weisshorn in quite challenging conditions. As Roland will describe though tonight, Tyndall was more than just a mountaineer. Over to you, Roland.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Nick, and it's a really great pleasure to be here and talking to you at the Alpine Club. Tyndall was born in Laughlin Bridge near Carlow in rural Southern Ireland around 1822 into a relatively humble family. He had a meteoric rise socially and scientifically, and in 1853 he was appointed Professor of Natural Philosophy at the Royal Institution under Michael Faraday himself, and remained there until he retired in 1887. In June 1856, he gave a lecture there on the cleavage of crystals and slate rocks, in which he argued that the plane of cleavage in slate was created by pressure alone, contrary to many beliefs then current. His friend Thomas Huxley suggested that might help explain the layered structure of glaciers. And they went out to the Alps that summer to examine the glaciers, and indeed Tyndall returned every year except one until his death in 1893. So here's the mer de glace in one of his slides, looking rather different from now. And Tyndall went out to test Forbes' theory that Nanna's just explained, the idea that glacier ice flowed as a viscous liquid. He measured its movement and examined its structure. And pointing out that ice cracks easily under tension, he came up with a theory of movement by what he called fracture and regelation, or fracture and refreezing, in addition to sliding slowly under gravity. Michael Faraday had discovered in 1850 that two pieces of moist ice touched together will instantly refreeze. And Tyndall used this to explain the breaking and joining up of glacier ice. He also argued that the lamellar structure of ice was due to pressure, as in slate. He wrote pages and pages of observations, and here's his sketch of the mer de glace and its tributary glaciers at the time. The argument with Forbes and his friends ran even after Forbes' death in 1868. And ironically, as I outline in my biography of Tyndall, they were both partly right, I think, and we can explore that later in discussion if people would like. Now, Tyndall climbed Mont Blanc 3 times, in 1857, 59, and 1860. Actually was the first person to camp overnight on the summit. It was while he was on Mont Blanc on the 13th of August 1857 that William Matthews discussed forming the Alpine Club with Edward Kennedy during their ascent of the Finsteraarhorn, the first British ascent. The AC, of course, was formed on the 22nd of December that year. Tyndall might well have been the first president, but he declined to join initially. He was elected a year later and made vice president in 1861, but he resigned soon afterwards for a variety of reasons that we can explore in discussion, if you like, at the end. It was around this time, in 1859, that Tyndall made arguably his greatest scientific discovery. He showed that many gases, including carbon dioxide and water vapor, absorb heat, what we now define as long-wave infrared radiation, and that they also radiate it. He realized that this explains what we now call the greenhouse effect, and indeed he described that clearly and how it works. And his research set the critical foundation for our understanding of the greenhouse effect itself, of meteorology, and indeed of climate change. Anyway, Tyndall kept climbing. Initially, it was a combination of science and mountaineering that grabbed him. He'd take the inevitable boiling point apparatus to the summit to measure the boiling point of water, like you did then. For example, when he climbed the Finsteraarhorn, shown here in 1858, rather not shown here in 1858, but he made the measurements in 1858. But soon it was the mountaineering itself that took over. Tyndall climbed Monte Rosa twice in that year, in 1858. On the second occasion, just a week after the first, he decided on the spur of the moment to make a solo ascent, almost certainly the first. Having done the energy calculation, he took just a ham sandwich and a small flask of tea with him. It was extremely uncommon to climb guideless, let alone solo at the time, so this was a remarkable feat. And his letter to Sarah Faraday, Faraday's wife, about it was published by Michael Faraday in the Times, much to Tindall's surprise. And he would have had, of course, a much easier trip over the glacier than you do today, as you can see for those contemporary and current photos. But as a mountaineer, he's probably best known for making the first ascent of the Weisshorn in 1861 with Bennen and Walter. In fact, he insisted that Bennen stand on the top first. Here it is from the Oberland, and here it is from the dome hut at dawn, just opposite in the valley. The ridge he climbed from Randa is the east ridge on the left, still, of course, the normal route. And here's his bivouac site. There was no hut then, of course, and this site, for those who've been up the path, you may have missed it, but it's just a few minutes below the current hut. And it's the only obvious spot for a bivouac, really, just beside the path, and looks pretty similar today to what it did 150 years ago. And here, of course, is the foreshortened east ridge of the Weisshorn from a little bit below the south summit. Looking back across the valley, of course, you see the dome, which Tyndall once tried from the Sass side, but was driven back by poor weather. Although in the poor weather of 1863, he did climb the Jungfrau up on the left, having slept in the Faulberg cave next to the glacier, like they all did then, before the days of the Concordia hut. In 1864, he had a 1,000-foot fall on the Piz Mortar Arch, very, very nearly killing himself. That's to the right here, looking up the remains of the glacier. And in passing, I should note that he climbed around this time on the Isle of Wight chalk cliffs with Alfred Tennyson, who of course lived there. It was years before Mick Fowler in chalk cliff climbing, and he gives possibly the earliest descriptions we have of climbing on Cornish and Northern Irish sea cliffs. So by now he was a famous mountaineer, and here he is in the well-known picture of the club room at Zermatt in the front standing group. On the left standing is John Ball with the rope across his chest, then William Matthews, T.S. Kennedy, T.G. Bonney, and Tindall there in the hat, looking very cool underneath the ice axe of Ulrich Launer, and Alfred Wills on the right with his arms folded. Only two women, of course, in that picture, Lucy Walker and Katerina Zeiler by the door. He climbed the Eiger in 1867, of course, by the west flank, not the Mittelegi Ridge as seen here. The west flank was the only route up the mountain at the time. And I show this route merely to acknowledge and pay tribute to our revered president, who is seen here topping out on the summit ridge a few years ago. Tyndall tried the Matterhorn several times, all from the Italian side. In 1860, he got a decent way up. And in 1862, having borrowed Whymper's tent, he got to the then highest point, just here on the ridge, now known as the Peak Tindall. But in 1868, so 3 years after Whymper, he made the first traverse and the seventh ascent overall. It was a pretty bold undertaking, since as far as he knew, at that point, no one had been up or down the Swiss Ridge since Whymper's disaster. But he reasoned that if 3 of them had got down alive, it ought to be possible to repeat the feat. In fact, when they got to the top, they found footprints because Julius Elliott had just made the second ascent of the Hurndall Ridge the day before. Now, Elliott sadly died on the Schreckhorn the following year, and actually Tindall arrived in Grindelwald just as they were retrieving his body from the glacier. Incidentally, when Tindall got back to the Monte Rosa Hotel, Zeiler asked him if it would be advisable to place ropes and chains at dangerous points. Tindall replied, and I quote, "You will save life, but you will spoil the mountain." So I have to admit, when I did it, I was quite glad of them. And then there was the Allertshorn, which he climbed in 1869, here seen from the north. first climbed by Francis Fox Tuckett in 1859 with Tyndall's guide, Benham. Tindall had actually attempted it guideless with Arthur Girdlestone in 1866, but a storm drove them down. And here's the mountain from the other side. And it was during this ascent that Tyndall came up with a beautiful phrase of "we live in the sky, not under it." Tyndall was the first person to explain clearly why the sky is blue, and because blue light is scattered preferentially all around us. And that gives the sense that we actually all live in the sky with this scattering all about us. Tyndall climbed the Bernina somewhere in this cloud in 1871, and he attempted the Aiguille du Géant with Thomas Kennedy in 1872. It wasn't actually climbed until 1882. And then he climbed the Alachorn for the second time. And then in 1877, with his young wife, Louisa, 25 years younger than him, he built a chalet above Belle Alp on Alp Lusgen at the southern end of the Oberland, overlooking Brieg. And that's him by the gate at the front, and Louisa, I think you can just about see her in the doorway of the hut. He climbed the Wetterhorn with her in 1875, and the Alachorn with her for his third time in 1876. And that must have been quite an early ascent of the Alachorn by a woman. This is Alp Lusgen today, his chalet today. It still exists. Unfortunately, as far as I can work out, very, very rarely used, about 2 weeks in the year, and I've never been able to get inside, sadly. Been there several times. Now, sadly, Louisa Tindall killed her husband by accident, I hasten to add, giving him an overdose of the wrong substance. She outlived him by 47 years, and she set up this memorial in 1911 above Alp Lusgen with beautiful views to the Weisshorn, the Matterhorn, and so much else. So that's Tyndall, tremendous scientist and tremendous mountaineer. If you want to read more, there's fortunately this book. It's out in hardback, and the paperback will be published next month. It's actually officially the bicentenary of his birth on the 2nd of August, though we think he was probably born a year or two later. So that's Tyndall, and now back to Nick.
Thank you, Roland. Fantastic. And finally tonight, Rachel Hewitt is a lecturer in creative writing at Newcastle University. She's Deputy Director at the Newcastle Centre for the Literary Arts and also a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. Her award-winning books include Map of a Nation, a biography of the Ordnance Survey, and A Revolution of Feeling, the decade that forged the modern mind. She's currently working on In Her Nature, which blends memoir and biography to explore women's relationships with the outdoors, and this won the Eccles British Library Writers Award, which is a work in progress prize. Tonight she's talking about mountaineer and winter sportswoman Lizzie Leblond, who's born about 1860. Lizzie found freedom and independence in the Alps, away from the pressures of being a wife and mother in Victorian society. As Lizzie wrote, "I owe a supreme debt of gratitude to the mountains for knocking from me the shackles of conventionality, but I had to struggle hard for my freedom."
So the mountaineer that I'd like to talk about today is a woman called Lizzie Leblond, who is variously known through her life, thanks to multiple marriages, as Elizabeth Hawkins Whitshed, Mrs. Fred Burnaby, Mrs. Elizabeth Main, Mrs. Aubrey Leblond, Lizzie Leblond, or simply Lizzie, which is how I'm going to refer to her. She was born in Greystones in County Wicklow, a little way south of Dublin, in 1860, to a very wealthy family, really, a family who was closely related to the Dukes of Portland, who owned most of Marylebone in London. Lizzie first visited Switzerland, Interlaken, in the autumn of either 1879 or 1880. She was aged either 19 or 20. In 1881, she travelled from Interlaken to Chamonix, and on the 25th of July, 1881, Lizzie had one of her first mountaineering experiences, receiving a certificate for ascending Les Grandes Mulets with the guides Jean-Pierre Balma and Alphonse Charlet. The next summer, 1882, she returned to Chamonix, and there she climbed Mont Blanc twice, as well as the Aiguilles de Belvédère, the Aiguilles de Tacoul, and the Pont de Geras. She left Chamonix for Montreux in November, but she returned to Chamonix in December 1882. And then with her guide, Edouard Coupelat, she started making a number of pioneering winter ascents. The Alpine Journal in 1883 described these as, in their words, an unparalleled series of winter ascents, executed by a lady, which will form one of the most brilliant chapters in the history of winter mountaineering. So high praise indeed. These winter ascents led to a publishing contract for Lizzie Leblond's first book, The High Alps in Winter, which was published in late 1883. And it led to a prolonged love affair with Switzerland for Lizzie, mostly the Upper Engadine region, where she lived between the mid-1880s and 1896. She lived in a room at the Kulm Hotel in St. Moritz, often joined by her young son, Harry, and her mother. And she became a chronicler in photographs and in fiction and non-fiction publications of the birth of winter sports in the Alps and the social culture that was built up around these sports. Her books and photographs, and she took thousands of photographs, they chart how regions of Switzerland that were initially famous for health tourism, for their sanatoria and the milk cures for tuberculosis, she charted how these regions transformed in the 1880s and 1890s into centres for winter sport, populated by wealthy European and American visitors. In St. Moritz, Lizzie photographed Arthur Conan Doyle. Here's Arthur Conan Doyle, an early pioneer of skiing in Switzerland. And here he is dressed as a Viking on his way to an evening party in St. Moritz. She photographed women toboggan and skeleton racing, including on the recently built Cresta Run. She photographed figure skating championships, curling matches and tennis matches, featuring sportswomen such as Lottie Dodd. Here's Lottie Dodd, who at the age of 15 had become the youngest ladies singles tennis player ever to win Wimbledon. And after winning Wimbledon another 5 times, followed by winning the British Ladies Amateur Golf Championship, then playing for the English women's national field hockey team, and winning a silver medal in archery at the 1908 Olympics, Lottie Dodd is now thought to be the most versatile athlete in history. Lizzie wrote about, as well as photographed, her own experiences of mountaineering and winter sport and her life in St. Moritz. She published tens of articles in magazines and journals and 15 further books after the High Alps in winter, including an autobiography called Day In, Day Out, which was published in 1928. Lizzie largely stopped climbing in the Alps in September 1896 after Roman Imboden, the 27-year-old son of her longtime guide Joseph Imboden, died in an accident on the Liscam. After 3 seasons climbing in Norway, in summer 1900, Lizzie married for the 3rd time to a ceramics collector called Aubrey Leblond. And then she left Switzerland for good in 1900, leaving behind a suitcase at the Kulm Hotel, which contained thousands of her photographic prints. She and Aubrey travelled extensively throughout Asia before returning to London, where in 1907, Lizzie was instrumental in setting up an Alpine Club for women, first as a subsidiary of the Lyceum Club. In late 1909, the so-called Lyceum Alpine Club decided to secede, and the Ladies Alpine Club was established as a separate entity, with Lizzie as its first president. During and after World War I, Lizzie remained hugely active within the Ladies Alpine Club, and she died in 1934 at the age of 74 at a house in Llandrindod Wells belonging to her brother-in-law. I'm interested by the fact that in the early 20th century, many female mountaineers conceived of mountaineering as having a clearly political resonance. And it's striking, I think, that a significant proportion of the early members of the Ladies Alpine Club were active suffragists, So for example, Eva McLaren, here's a sort of sketch of her on the left, and Frances Heron Maxwell, it's a photo of her on the right. They both became members of the Ladies Alpine Club on the 27th of October 1910. McLaren was on the Central Committee of the National Society for Women's Suffrage. She was a leading member of the Women's Liberal Federation. She was active in the Union of Practical Suffragists. And with Frances Heron Maxwell, they co-founded the Forward Suffrage Union in 1908. And I think it's sort of interesting to kind of probe this association between sort of women's mountaineering and political representation a little bit further. On the one hand, women's participation in mountaineering is evidence that women's potential strength and in their endurance and their independence, that this all goes against sort of stereotypical ideas about women's frailty and dependence that could be marshaled in favour of men representing women politically. But it's also worth noting, I think, that voting and voting rights and political representation are all closely tied up with attitudes to land and land ownership. Prior to 1918, all voting rights depended upon owning or renting private land of a certain value. And in 18th century landscape poetry, I think it's really interesting that there's often a link that's drawn between being a responsible, politically engaged gentleman and the degree to which such gentlemen cared for and appreciated their private estates and the sort of aesthetics of the landscape of those estates. So I think that when, in the early 20th century, female mountaineer suffragists are photographed waving banners for votes for women on the summit of mountains, you know, this is important, that their presence on commonly owned land, in national parks and sort of wild places, you know, this isn't accidental. 200 years earlier, if political representation was being symbolically linked to the ownership of private land, and here in the early 20th century, calls for widening political representation, widening voting rights, yes, to women, but also to men without property, you know, these calls are being linked to images of mountaineers roaming free over commonly owned land. So I need to kind of conclude now, and I think, you know, I want to do so really by saying that, you know, there's a lot about Lizzie Leblond that makes her fascinating, you know, in her own right. She has this kind of wonderfully acerbic, wry voice in her writings. She's almost pathologically independent. And her achievements in mountaineering, photography, and literature, I think, make her deserving of much more attention than she's received so far. Let's have a picture of her to accompany this conclusion. But what I also want to point to is how a focus on Lizzie's life can also open a window into the history of women's mountaineering more generally. I'm interested in how Lizzie's life and writings can point to the advantages and the pleasures that the Alps held for women specifically. And I'm interested in the way in which discussions during the early years of the Ladies Alpine Club show acute awareness of the specific physical requirements and the specific sort of challenges and obstacles that women faced in early 20th century mountaineering. But mostly, I think, you know, I share Adeline Edwards' view that it's crucial to build up and preserve a historical record of women's mountaineering. That in each generation, women are left feeling like outliers, but that also they have to start from the very beginning again in each generation, building up knowledge and expertise from scratch. So recovering the lives and the achievements and the writings, the voices of women like Lizzie Leblond can help everyone, but especially I think sort of present day female mountaineers, to feel at home in the mountains and to realise that women have always been there. Thank you.
So thank you very much to Rachel for sending that in. I'm going to kick off with a question for Roland. I was quite interested to see that chalet there that Tyndall built, the Lusgen chalet. Just wondered if you know who owns it. Certainly looks like a brilliant spot. You know, it might be a good place for an Alpine Club hut, maybe.
That's a lovely little chalet. It's in a beautiful position. It looks down at the hotel and the chapel that was built by the English on Belle Alp, and up behind is the Sparhorn, what used to be called the Sparrenhorn. I think it's owned by a dentist or doctor who lives in Zurich, and from what I can gather, talking to the locals, they only use it about one week in summer and 1 week in winter. I've written to them, I've left letters with the post office, but I've had no reply and I've never been able to get in. It's very sad. The Alpine Club did get in there when it was sold by the family, I don't know, 50 years ago probably, and there was still some of Tyndall's experimental tubes in the house. Amazing.
Oh, thanks, Roland. Good. So next, Neil Pitts. Neil, can you? Perhaps we need to unmute you, don't we? Oh, there. Go ahead, Neil.
I'm not quite sure who to put this question to because Rachel is clearly not with us. But it's a question about the contribution of women to the Alpine Club. I mean, the Ladies Alpine Club, I think, was brought into under the auspices of the Alpine Club in 1975, and in these days of inclusivity at the Alpine Club, we have all these marvellous pictures of past presidents, but there are no pictures of the past president or the lady presidents of the Ladies Alpine Club. And I was wondering if that is anything that anyone had ever given consideration to.
That's a good question, Neil. It's probably one for Victor, who's the president. I don't know if Victor's here, but to answer, did Roland or Nanna want to say anything about that?
Well, firstly, I think Victor is here. Secondly, I know I can see Claire Roche in watching this, who knows a little bit about women mountaineering, so she might have a thought.
I think it's a great idea, really. I mean, when the Women's Alpine Club joined the Alpine Club, it wasn't a great thing for the Women's Alpine Club. They kind of got eaten up by this much larger organisation, and women's matters really were not, well, they were sort of subsumed under the much bigger membership. I liked the presentation about Lizzie Leblond. But she almost kind of was standing on the shoulders of those who went before, because there was a great, an enormous number of women who were climbing before that, who were basically rendered silent because it wasn't done to publish. They couldn't really write as much as men and publicize what they were up to. So it's long overdue, really, I think, that those women pioneers in the Alps got some recognition. And the idea that we had some portraits or photographs of the first women presidents of the Ladies Alpine Club, I think would be a brilliant idea.
First of all, thank you very much, Roland. That was really interesting. I've got two little questions. You alluded to the conflict between, as a scientist, maybe you can explain this to us. You alluded to the conflict between Tindall and Forbes about the way glaciers flow. You said maybe they're a little bit right, both of them. How?
But in terms of what they were doing, Forbes had this idea that the glacier flowed like a viscous liquid, which of course it sort of looks like a sort of river. But Tyndall said, no, you just see it cracks under a small amount of tension, and ice refreezes, bits of ice refreeze when you push them together. It's just sliding down and cracking and refreezing and cracking and refreezing. But I think they're both right, because I think ice is a much more complex substance than they knew at the time. And I think Philip Meredith is online as well, who'd be able to give a better explanation. But the property of ice depends a lot on the pressure it's under, the temperature, the rate at which it's put under strain. So at the bottom of a deep glacier, ice does actually move like a viscous liquid, but the top part, of course, doesn't. It cracks and breaks. So you could argue that Forbes, you might naively argue, I think, that Forbes was right about the bottom of a deep glacier, and Tindall was more right about the top.
Just to say that I think Roland is exactly right, and both of these guys predated the theory of viscoelasticity, and people didn't realize that materials like ice, rocks, and glass deformation is rate dependent. So, for example, glass is actually a super cooled fluid. So if you deform glass slowly, it flows, but if you throw a brick at it, it fractures, as we all know. Well, only those who've thrown bricks at glass, obviously. So Roland is exactly right. They were both half right, and I assume that means they were both half wrong as well. So if ice flows slowly, it flows like a viscous fluid, like treacle. If it goes faster, then it will fracture above a certain strain rate. So that we now know, but they didn't. So they both observed different phenomena, which they thought was right, and they were right within the phenomena they were observing. But they were observing different phenomena in the same material. So it's very confusing, like most things in life. That's
Thanks,
it.
Bill. Thanks very much. I mean, that perhaps brings us to the obvious question: who was the better scientist, Tyndall, of the two we've been talking about tonight? I don't know if you've got a theory on that, Nanna or Roland.
Well, I mean, it's always hard to judge two different types of physicists. You know, Tyndall was writing after Forbes, right? You know, and Tyndall was much younger than Forbes. And I think when we talk about the relationship between their interpretation of glaciers, one of the things that's important to remember, I think, is that in the period, quite a lot of people didn't quite understand what Tyndall was actually getting at. Like, why did he think his version was actually different to Forbes's? Because a lot of people thought that viscosity was more of a descriptive quality than a principle or a scientific theory as such. And that's what Tyndall sort of also caught on to, and he said, well, if it's not a scientific theory, then my version, my interpretation is more sort of complete or full, because it can sort of like explain more of the elements that went into it. So who was the better physicist or scientist? You know, I'm partial to Tyndall because I worked as part of the John Tyndall Correspondence Project, as has Roland. But I have a weak spot for Forbes as well, because I feel like he got left behind in a lot of ways, both in terms of his understanding of how all the new media of the time, all the newspapers worked. You know, he wasn't quite as savvy as Tyndall and Huxley and the other scientific naturalists were. And so I feel like he gets a bad rep sometimes.
I think Forbes' other problem was that he was stuck up in Edinburgh, whereas Tyndall was down at the centre of everything in London.
Yeah, for sure.
It's interesting we've talked today about 2 Irish people and 1 Scots. That's quite a nice trio.
Should we go to Charles Sherwood next?
I just wanted to follow up on the question as to why Tindall resigned from our revered club.
Okay. There are a number of sort of reasons given for this. One is that Leslie Stephen, at a dinner at the Alpine Club, made some rather sort of sarcastic remarks about people carrying boiling point apparatus to the top of mountains and things like that. But I think I've come to the view, looking at all the various evidence, that he resigned partly because he didn't want the club to have any claim on his writings. It might seem a strange thing. It was Longman, who was a member of the Alpine Club, who published his first book, Glaciers of the Alps. And Tyndall published one piece in the first edition of Peaks, Passes and Glaciers. But he started writing a lot after that and wanted to publish outside the ambit of the club. He never published in the Alpine Journal. So there is some evidence to say that that was ultimately the reason. I suspect it was a combination of things. He never liked dining at the Alpine Club. He found the dinners, I think, boorish, and he preferred to dine with his scientific friends at the Royal Society Club. So it was a combination of things.
Thanks, Roland. Thanks, Charles, for that. Charles McCombie, can you hear me?
Yeah, thank you. Incidentally, as a Scottish person, but also Swiss and living in Switzerland, I did object to the Edinburgh comment, yeah. But the other point I wanted to make, I'm interested in the history of these people, of course, since I am Swiss and Scottish. And the one who is most controversial of the ancient mountaineers who are shown is of course, Agassiz. Agassiz is a hugely controversial figure because he was out and out racist, and he went to Harvard University and introduced the whole concept of white racism to Harvard. And right now in the current situation in the world, this is kind of a topical issue because quite recently back in Lausanne, which is south of Switzerland here, they actually went back and renamed the Louis Agassiz Square and changed the name of it and took down statues of him. So it's an old story that's gone through, but Agassiz was not a nice person as opposed to the other two who are both most of the time nice people. Thanks.
Well, I think a number of people at that time, a lot of people at that time had what we would see now as pretty racist views. And actually Tindall was not an exception. He wasn't as outspoken as some of them, but he very clearly believed that white people were superior in intellect and all the rest. They had the evidence from, supposed evidence from relative brain sizes and the rest, and he bought those arguments. So no, he wasn't without sin there either. I don't know what Forbes' positions were. Nanna may know more about Forbes' attitudes to race.
No, unfortunately, I don't. But it's worth pointing out that Agassiz was a polygenist, and so in that way was also in his scientific writings on human origins significantly different to what Tyndall was believed as well. It's a Tyndall of course still had, as Roland said, a ton of prejudice, but it was a different form that Agassiz was advocating for, which is definitely correct.
Nanna, I wonder if you could explain what a polygenist is.
So in the 19th century, there was very roughly mid-19th century, there was very roughly two types of theories about the origins of humans. One of them was the monogenicists. They believed that all humans originated from one singular point. So all humans have a single common ancestor that they then evolved in some way or the other from. Polygenicists believe that humans are fundamentally different and that humans arrive from a multiple origin, so that different races of humans come from different origins, right? And so when you believe that, it sort of lends itself to a more, in some ways, a more extreme type of racism, as it is. And I think that's also why some of Agassiz's influences in the US has been very, it's not just him, of course, but very damaging indeed.
Okay, thank you. We've got some questions coming in from YouTube, I think, or it may just be from Nigel. Okay, Nigel.
I just wanted to go back to Neil's point about the Ladies Alpine Club portraits. I just wanted to make a plug for some things that we are doing. Next year, it's 100 years of the Pinnacle Club, and we're going to be doing an exhibition celebrating Pinnacle Club and Ladies Alpine Club members. And that'll be at Charlotte Road. And we've won a grant to digitize some of our collection, and that's going toward digitizing the Ladies Alpine Club archive. So that'll all be online. So that's just a couple of things that we're doing to celebrate some of the Ladies Alpine Club and women members of the Alpine Club over the next couple of years. And I think the portraits will be a good idea too.
Thanks, Nigel. That's really good. And as I mentioned last week, we're really hoping to well, next year is the 150th anniversary since the first female ascent of the Matterhorn, which was 22nd of August 1871 by Lucy Walker. And I'm looking for women who are keen to perhaps, meet up and have a meet and perhaps just mark that occasion in some way. I think that'd be quite cool. But obviously I'm a man, but it'd be great to have have some help with setting something up. So if anyone is interested, do get in touch with me. I think Nanna's got a question, actually. Nanna, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question for Roland, which I'm hoping that you might be able to answer. It's also about Lizzie as well. But I was thinking about when you looked at the pictures of Lizzie in her dress and also the pictures of Louisa Tindall, when they were climbing, do you know if that's what they wore, or if they actually wore trousers and the dresses were just for the photo ops?
Can I ask Claire to answer that one? I think I sort of know the answer, but Claire is much more of an expert than me on this.
Yeah, they wore dresses, really, most of them, right up until the sort of 1890s. They would shorten them, and they wore sort of leggings and stuff underneath. But it was only sort of, the 1890s, Richardson's Mary Payon, a French climber who climbed with Richardson, was one of the first to wear trousers or breeches the whole time. But Richardson, who was, arguably one of the best women climbers at the time, always declined, saying that actually she could move much better in dresses. And when you think about it, they were used to moving in dresses. We didn't have the nice stretchy lycra sort of stuff that we've got these days. So suddenly climbing in tweed breeches, I think, was quite difficult for them. So no, they did climb in dresses, but just made some adjustments, shortening them. Some of the pictures of Lizzie Leblanc show her with really quite short skirts. And the other thing about them wearing skirts is it's a lot easier to have a wee when you've got a lot of blokes around you. Okay, so there are practical considerations other than the mere climbing. Yeah.
Okay, so I think that brings us to the end of the evening. So do have a look at the Alpine Club Library YouTube page, where you can watch, like and share all previous Alpine ClubCasts. And thanks all for joining us. Keep safe, keep active, keep alert, and please unmute yourself now so we can all applaud tonight's speakers. Good night from London.
Brilliant, brilliant. Yeah.